She burned 300 people alive, then became queen again. Before the fire, before the screams, before the ash that soaked the streets of London like winter fog, there was a little girl, born into gold and steel, a royal daughter with trembling hands, dark eyes that saw too much, and a name soaked in history. Mary Tudor. But the world didn't call her princess for long. They called her the mistake, the inconvenience, the thorn in a crown that no longer fit. Her father, King Henry VIII, once adored her. But love from that man was a coin that flipped fast. The moment Anne Boleyn walked into his bedchamber, Mary became a problem. A symbol of the queen he wanted to erase, Catherine of Aragon, Spain's daughter, a Catholic thorn in his Protestant dream. Henry needed a son. Anne promised one. And so Mary, barely 9 years old, was stripped of her titles, her status, even her servants. The girl who once had gowns from Paris and tutors from Oxford was suddenly the Lady Mary, cast aside like a broken relic. She was forced to wait hand and foot on her baby half-sister Elizabeth, the red-haired daughter of Anne Boleyn. Humiliation wasn't punishment enough. They wanted obedience. So they told Mary to sign a paper. It declared her illegitimate, a bastard, not the king's daughter, not anyone's heir. She refused. At 13, she stared down the men sent to terrify her, threatened with prison, with exile, with death. But Mary knew one thing. If she signed that paper, she'd be nothing, a ghost inside her own country. And then one day, the threats stopped. Because Anne Boleyn lost the king's favor. She gave birth to a daughter. Then she had a miscarriage, then another. And when Henry got bored, he turned deadly. Anne Boleyn was executed, and Mary, she was still alive. The next queen, Jane Seymour, tried to mend things. She made Henry speak to Mary again, made her sign the damn paper. But even as Mary put ink to parchment, her eyes didn't blink. She signed it with her hand, but not with her soul. Years passed. Queens came and went. Henry's court was a carousel of silk, secrets, and blood. And through it all, Mary waited. She watched her father grow fat and sick, watched Elizabeth grow clever and sly, and watched the Protestant Reformation eat her country from the inside. She had no allies, no power, no crown. But she had one thing: memory. And memory, when it festers, becomes fuel. By the time Henry VIII died, England was splintered. His son, Edward VI, a sickly boy of 9, took the throne, but he was no puppet. Behind him were men, regents, nobles, counselors, men who wanted a Protestant England, and a Catholic Mary didn't fit into that vision. They tried to keep her quiet, told her she couldn't hear Mass, sent spies into her estate. But Mary was done obeying. She held Mass in secret, sent letters to Catholic families, built networks like spider webs in the shadows. She smiled in public, but every night she made plans, because she knew Edward was dying. By 16, his bones stuck out of his robes. His cough never stopped. His skin turned gray. And Mary, she waited. Then came the plot. Edward, barely able to speak, signed a document, the devise for the succession. It skipped over both Mary and Elizabeth. It handed the crown to Lady Jane Grey, a teenage girl with royal blood and Protestant loyalty. The moment Edward died, the coup began. Jane was crowned. Mary was hunted. But they forgot who they were dealing with. Mary vanished, disappeared from her estate in the middle of the night, and reappeared in Norfolk with a small army of loyalists, fishermen, farmers, soldiers, priests. They marched on London not with guns, but with faith. Catholic families opened their doors, peasants kissed her feet, and as the city quaked with confusion, something wild happened. The people rose. Thousands shouted her name. Bells rang. Jane Grey's supporters melted away. Her army became a mob. The council betrayed her. And just like that, after only 9 days on the throne, Jane was dragged out of the palace. The girl who never asked to be queen became a prisoner. And Mary became Queen of England. But the story doesn't end there. That's where it begins. Because Mary wasn't just returning to rule. She was returning to settle scores. The years of exile, the insults, the bastard papers, the forced obedience, the murdered Catholics, the Protestant lies. The queen they tried to erase had come back not to reign, but to purify. And she would do it with fire. The first flames were lit in secret. A few Protestant preachers burned quietly in the countryside. Heretics, they were called. But the people whispered. The air smelled strange. And the queen's eyes, those eyes that once belonged to a broken girl, they burned colder than the flames she ordered. Her advisors told her to stop. Even Philip of Spain, her husband by political design, told her to be merciful. But Mary was done listening to men. She passed the Heresy Acts, brought back laws older than the Reformation, gave bishops the power to condemn. And once the laws were in place, the executions became public. They say the first real fire was lit in Smithfield. John Rogers, a scholar and preacher, he had children, a wife. He begged for mercy. Mary watched it happen. She didn't blink. And still, the people believed in her. They said she was restoring the old ways. They called her Mary the Pious. They thought the killings would stop, but they didn't stop. They multiplied. By the hundreds. They came from every walk of life. Printers, farmers, nuns, teenage girls, old widows, teachers. Some were accused of denying transubstantiation, others for owning an English Bible, one for refusing to bow, another for refusing to recant a hymn. Each one was tied to a stake, surrounded by kindling, prayed over, then burned. They screamed in languages the courts didn't understand, cried out names, cried out for their children, and still the fires roared. Over 300 bodies, over 300 souls, all under one queen. The country that once wept for Mary began to turn cold. Londoners stopped attending executions. Priests began to question verdicts. Even Mary's supporters started whispering in corners. But Mary didn't flinch. She believed this was God's work, her mission, her calling, to cleanse a country that had betrayed her church, her family, and her very name. She was saving England, even if it screamed, even if it burned. But there was one thing she didn't expect. Time. Time, which had once been her enemy, now turned on her in reverse. Her health began to fail. Her womb, once prayed over by every priest in the land, never carried a child. Her phantom pregnancies ended in bleeding and shame, and the people who once screamed her name in joy now cursed it under their breath. But she wasn't finished. Not yet. There was still one more betrayal to come. One so personal, so cruel, it would destroy her legacy forever. And it would come from the man she trusted most, her own husband. By the time Mary Tudor walked into marriage, she wasn't walking toward love. She was walking toward a throne she couldn't keep without a man. England didn't trust queens to rule alone, especially not Catholic ones. She needed a husband, not just to secure her crown, but to give her a child, a son, a living heir who could keep her blood on England's throne and her faith in its churches. And so, they brought her Philip of Spain. He was tall, cold, royal, and ruthless, the son of Emperor Charles V, ruler of half the known world, a Catholic prince from the Habsburg dynasty, a man who wore velvet like armor and didn't smile unless it served him. He was everything Mary's council feared, and everything Mary believed would save her. But the moment his boots touched English soil, the air shifted. People lined the streets, but they didn't cheer. They stared, silent, suspicious. They knew Spain didn't marry for love. It married for land, power, and control. and now its prince was walking into their queen's chambers like a man claiming ownership. Still, Mary smiled. Still, she gave him her hand. And still, she signed the marriage treaty that made Philip King of England, though only in name. But Mary didn't notice the stares, didn't hear the whispers, because for the first time in her cursed, broken, blood-stained life, she felt wanted. She thought she'd found a partner. Instead, she'd just handed her country to a man who saw her as a pawn. Philip didn't stay long. 3 months after the wedding, he left. No warning, no ceremony, just packed up and returned to Spain. He said it was urgent empire business. But the truth was brutal. He was bored. Mary, now 38, was older, deeply religious, and obsessively clinging to his image. Philip wanted war, expansion, legacy. Mary wanted mass, prayer, babies. And for the first time since the fires began, she couldn't control what she loved most. But when Philip left, something else happened. Mary stopped bleeding. Her stomach grew, her breasts swelled, and suddenly, England rejoiced. The Queen was pregnant. Finally, after all the death, all the fires, all the executions, Mary would give birth to a Catholic heir. The crowds returned. The bells rang. Poets wrote sonnets. Priests wept at the altar. They prepared a nursery, built a cradle of gold. Foreign embassies lined up to offer gifts. And Mary sang lullabies to her stomach alone at night, believing, needing, desperate. 9 months passed. Then 10, then 11, and nothing. No baby, no labor, no movement, just a slow, sick unraveling. Her belly began to shrink, her body began to ache, her mind broke. She hid behind curtains, refused to speak to doctors, accused her maids of betrayal, screamed at God in Latin. What happened wasn't just a miscarriage. It was a phantom pregnancy, a symptom of extreme psychological and hormonal stress. Her body created the illusion. Her mind created the child. And the country? It turned cold again. Philip, hearing the news from Spain, did not return. Instead, he wrote a letter, 1 line, 10 words, cold as stone. I pray for your recovery. The empire awaits my return. Mary never forgot that sentence. She read it every night for a year, then burned it, then ordered more executions. But even that didn't soothe her anymore. Because something darker was building, something even fire couldn't burn out. Fear. Her counselors began to plot behind her back. The nobles who had once handed her the throne began aligning with Elizabeth, her red-haired bastard half-sister. The people no longer trusted her God. And Philip? Philip returned, yes, but only to drag England into war. Not her war, his. He wanted Mary to join Spain against France, to send English troops, English gold, English ships, all for a fight she never asked for. She hesitated. And Philip, he smiled, touched her shoulder, and told her if she loved him, she'd do it. So she did. And the price was Calais, England's last foothold in France, a city they'd held for 2 centuries, a piece of their empire, ripped away in one brutal siege. Mary didn't even send an army to take it back. She just watched. And when the final letter came confirming the city's fall, she didn't cry. She whispered, "When I die, they will find Calais engraved on my heart." But she didn't die yet. She still had one more chance to give England an heir, one last pregnancy. And once again, the signs appeared. Her body changed. Her mood shifted. The doctors nodded. The court held its breath. But this time, Mary did not sing lullabies. She did not smile. She did not pray. Because deep down she knew it wasn't real. Just like last time. And this time, her body never recovered. Her skin went gray. Her legs swelled. Her teeth cracked. And through it all, she continued to sign death warrants, to light the fires, to force her nobles into Catholic Mass, to arrest Elizabeth again and again, to try desperately to freeze time. But history doesn't freeze. It turns, and Mary's fire was burning out. Philip returned one last time, but only to say goodbye. He brought no doctors, no child, no comfort. He kissed her hand, called her my queen, and whispered a final request. "If you die before me, do not name Elizabeth your heir." Mary nodded, but her eyes, empty. By now, even her most loyal supporters had fled. The priests were silent, the bells were still, the country was broke, her people starved, and the ash she created began to stain her crown. They didn't call her Mary the Pious anymore. They called her Bloody Mary, and then it was over. November 17th, 1558. Mary Tudor, Queen of England, daughter of Henry, defender of the Catholic faith, died alone in her chamber, surrounded not by friends or family, but by silence. No child, no legacy, no one to carry her name, except the woman she hated most, Elizabeth. And here's the final twist. The people rejoiced. As news spread that Elizabeth would take the crown, the streets filled. Crowds danced, nobles pledged loyalty, soldiers lowered their swords, church bells rang without orders. The very city that once carried Mary on their shoulders now carried her sister in triumph. They erased her name, tore down her images, whispered that she was mad, wrote books that twisted her faith into fanaticism, took the fires she ordered and lit them again. Only this time, they burned her memory. But she left something behind, something no one expected. A mirror, a warning, a ghost. Because when a woman is denied her birthright, tortured for her faith, and crowned in fear, she doesn't become a queen. She becomes a monster they created themselves. The bells tolled for Mary only once, not in grief, not in reverence, just formality. And then England moved on. They scrubbed her portraits from the palace walls, tossed her letters into the fire, burned her decrees the same way she had burned heretics. But the strangest thing wasn't the silence. It was how fast it all happened. One day she was queen, the next, she was a warning. The message was whispered across Europe, baked into pamphlets, sewn into court rumors. This is what happens when a woman rules with her heart instead of her head. But that wasn't Mary's legacy. That was Elizabeth's first move as queen. Elizabeth Tudor had watched her sister burn England into obedience for 5 years. She had seen the smoke rise from the prisons, had heard the rumors of phantom pregnancies, and had sat quietly while Mary dragged her in and out of the Tower of London, accused, interrogated, but never quite destroyed. Now the fire was out. And Elizabeth? She didn't waste a second. She didn't cry at Mary's funeral, didn't wear mourning black, didn't build a statue or commission a chapel or speak her sister's name in court. What she did do was rewrite. Within weeks of taking the throne, Elizabeth began a quiet, vicious campaign to erase Mary's reign, not just from policy, but from memory. The priests who had once walked with Mary were exiled. The altars she restored were smashed. The Catholic Mass was outlawed again, this time for good. But it wasn't just about religion, it was about control. Because Elizabeth didn't just want to rule. She wanted to make sure no one ever ruled like Mary again, so she took the most effective tool in monarchy, narrative, and she sharpened it like a dagger. Mary wasn't remembered as the girl exiled by her father, not the princess forced to deny her mother, not the queen who fought for her throne against impossible odds. They gave her one name, Bloody Mary, and here's where the twist gets cold. That nickname? It wasn't used during Mary's lifetime. Not by her people, not by her enemies, not even by the Protestants she condemned. It was born after her death, crafted in Elizabeth's court, whispered by advisors, and eventually printed in school books so thick they'd outlive centuries. It wasn't history, it was revenge branding. And it worked. They told children she drank the blood of heretics, that she laughed while they burned, that she tortured the innocent, that she enjoyed the smell of scorched flesh in the morning air. None of it provable. None of it even detailed in court records. But that was the brilliance. Because truth doesn't have to scream, it just has to echo, and once the echo begins, it never dies. Mary Tudor became the nightmare in every child's prayer. A game played in the mirror, a face summoned in darkness. Say her name 3 times, they whisper, and she appears. Not as a queen, not as a sister, not even as a woman, as a monster. But here's the twisted part. While Elizabeth was burying her sister's name in superstition, she was learning from her playbook. Mary burned bodies to control religion. Elizabeth bled enemies with laws. Mary executed Protestants in public squares. Elizabeth executed Catholics in silence, behind stone walls with no flames, no screams, no witnesses, just quiet vanishing. Mary ruled through terror. Elizabeth ruled through style, velvet diplomacy, painted faces, and whispered threats that felt like flattery. They were different queens, but not different weapons, just different disguises, and yet only one became a monster in the eyes of the world, because one ruled like a man, and one died like a woman. But the final betrayal wasn't written in fire. It was written in marble. When Mary died, she was buried in Westminster Abbey, a royal tomb, modest but noble. 7 years later, Elizabeth died, the Virgin Queen, the Protestant savior, and they buried her in the same tomb, directly on top of Mary's body. They didn't build Mary her own grave. They didn't carve her name in gold. They didn't give her even one sentence of peace. Instead, they wrote this: "Here lies Elizabeth, true daughter of the faith, who restored the realm." And beneath that, nothing. No mention of Mary, just silence. They buried her not beside her sister, but under her. Not as queen, but as a failure, a footnote, a ghost. But here's what they didn't count on. Ghosts don't stay buried, especially not when they're born in fire. Centuries later, historians began digging, not for graves, but for truths. And what they found shattered the fairy tale. They found Mary's letters, tender, complex, furious. They found council records showing mercy pleas she approved. They found that many of the executions she's blamed for were orchestrated by her bishops, often behind her back. They found evidence that even her worst decisions came from a place of desperate, impossible loyalty. To her God, to her country, to her father's name. They found a woman who'd been turned into a caricature. And they started asking the question no one dared to ask. What if Bloody Mary wasn't the villain? What if she was the first woman in power who scared men so much? They buried her twice. And now, her image is shifting again. Books are being rewritten. Universities are debating her legacy. Documentaries are peeling off the varnish. The girl who was told she was illegitimate, the teenager who refused to denounce her mother, the woman who took her throne back without a drop of blood. She's not forgotten. She's coming back, not as a queen, not as a ghost, but as a warning. If you push a woman to the edge of history long enough, she won't fall. She'll light the whole kingdom on fire.